What are the many wine flavors found in the various wine aromas wheels, with descriptions such as strawberry, apple and vanilla? So when we smell a wine, the alcohol volatilises and carries these lighter than air aromas compounds into your nose. Each wine can contain hundreds of different aroma compounds, and each compound can affect the flavor of a wine. From a chemical perspective, flavors are the manifestation of compounds that are released at a different stage during the wine life cycle. When we smell these compounds, a stimulus is transmitted in our brain that compares into a memory of known sensations, eventually conjuring a final impression. Being fascinated by science and empirical research, in this episode I spoke to Sietze Wijma, MSc Sensory Science graduate and founder of The Art of Tasting, who will walk us through some of the major flavor compounds, their names and chemistry, and explains how they get released and some of the faults in wines and how to detect them, and what are the key compounds that one should know. Before we get to the show, remember to subscribe and like. Now, on with the show. Hi, I'm Mattia Scarpazza, and this is the Looking Into Wine podcast. Wine and winemaking can be complex, but this podcast has a simple mission. We want to give you the skills and tools to harness your passion about wine. Through this series, we will shine a spotlight on some of the different regions, process, and concepts that shape the fascinating world of wine. I hope you enjoy the show and your own journey looking into wine. Welcome to the Looking Into Wine podcast. I'm Mattia Scarpazza, your host, and today we are talking about the science of flavors in wine, understanding how to recognize them, and most importantly, where they come from and how to use them to assess a wine. My guest is MSc Sensory Science graduate who is specialized in flavor chemistry. He enjoys sharing knowledge about the origin of flavors in drinks, and he has launched a training program all about flavors. I'm pleased to welcome to the show Sietze Wijma. Actually,
thanks, Mattia. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you here. I mean, it's very interesting because for me, it was when I seen about your program and I heard about you got in touch. It was really exciting because I never really looked into the chemistry of the flavors. I only studied them briefly during my studies, and it was not something I usually speak on a day-to-day, so I thoroughly enjoyed in the last few weeks reading about them and trying to get my head around some of these names, okay. Which I'm not at all familiar. Yeah, I'm not exciting. A chemist by any means of any imagination, so it's really interesting. But you are. So how did you? Well, you're a chemist, so you know more about chemistry definitely than me. How did you learn about the flavors? What's your background? How did you get your knowledge?
So I did a bachelor in psychology, and then I was really interested in the perception component of psychology. So I decided to study a master, which was in sensory science, which is really about flavor perception. So how the sense of smell and the sense of taste work together to combine this sensation, which is called flavor. And I did my internship in a company not far from away from London. They're based in Leatherhead, actually. They make flavor compounds. And so these are flavors that are intended to use for training purposes and education purposes. And I've worked there for 3 years, where I learned a lot about how flavors form in beers and in wines and in other beverages. And then I started to I decided to start my own company.
Okay, so you lead the tastings at the moment in Netherlands and in London, but you use a very specific flavor compound. There's not something you find. There's not a testing kit. You sent me some of the tasting, some of the flavors, and they were really advanced. What's the difference with them? Why using these specific flavors?
So basically the method is you pick a relatively neutral base wine. So it could be a neutral white wine or a red wine. And then you use several bottles. You keep one bottle as it is. And then the next few bottles, you add a single aromatic compound to each of the bottles. And if you do it in the right quantity, so if you use a level of the compound that's realistic for what you would find in wine as well, then it becomes a really good example of what that specific aroma smells like in wine. So it's a way to really understand what a green bell pepper flavor is, for example, in wine, or a banana flavor.
Okay, and so let's talk about some of these flavors and some of the lessons that you do. So you sent me some of the samples, and I basically, you receive these chemicals where you put in a natural liquid, which is water, in specific quantities, and then that releases the flavors inside this chemistry. I must admit, I didn't get a couple of them, and I tried them blind, and I was there, and I was a couple of them. I think it was bruised apple and vanilla I didn't get, but so walk me through how do you run one of your tasting? What is the principles?
So my lineup is often 10 different flavors, and then after we've discussed all of them, then I usually ask people to leave the room momentarily. Then I change the order of the glasses. Then they come back in, and then they have to name what flavor is in each of the 10 glasses. So that would be a method of training yourself to detecting these compounds.
When we're talking about the wine flavors, and just to get to some of the technicality out, I think is a good. So what are the most famous or the main categories in wine flavors? What would be the name that everybody should know about if you're interested in flavors in wine?
So a very useful distinction is to distinguish between primary, secondary, and tertiary flavors. And I'm sure you and your listeners will be familiar with this, but just to recap, primary flavors, those are the ones that come from the grape, that come from fermentation. Secondary flavors are the result of winemaking techniques, such as oak aging or malolactic fermentation. And tertiary aromas, they develop in the bottle. Okay, they're the result of bottle aging. Now, for example, if we have a look at the primary aromas, then you can distinguish between those that are present in the grape before fermentation even starts, and then those that are formed or that are released during fermentation. And a nice example of a group of compounds that is present in the grapes or that are in certain grapes are methoxypyrazines, right? So it's a technical term. So it's a subclass of pyrazines. And within methoxypyrazines, you can distinguish between two main pyrazines. And the first one is bell pepper pyrazine, and the next one is potato pyrazine. And they're called that way because, guess what? The first one smells like a green bell pepper, and the second one smells like potato skins. And the first one is related to a group of very specific grape varieties, mainly the Bordeaux varieties. So in the case of white wine, we're looking at Sauvignon Blanc. In the case of red wine, it could be like Carmenère or Cabernet Sauvignon. The other pyrazine is a bit less common, but it's the result of a specific taint in wine known as the ladybug taint. So that's the result of ladybugs that end up in the grape crusher, and that then impart this potato skins flavor. It's a very specific flavor. But much more common is the bell pepper pyrazine. And often when wine tasters refer to pyrazines, they really mean that green bell pepper.
Okay, so in terms of like compounds, where are the flavors usually stored into a grape? Would you find them more in the skins or or inside the pulps? Because you were saying earlier about during fermentation getting released. So if you know, I don't really know this. Where?
Yeah, so most of the aromatics come from the skins. So there are several that are present in the pulp as well, but pulp is mainly the source of sugars and acids. And if you're looking at very specific compounds, and they include the pyrazines, you're typically looking at higher concentrations in the skins as compared with the pulp.
And so let's say, Let's talk about the. You were talking about the pyrazine and the Sauvignon Blanc. What also Sauvignon Blanc is often. There is an association with this cat pea aroma. So what is it like? Why do we get these flavors? Do we get is there any flavors that then any compound that then we get confused or we can?
Yes. So there are two important compounds if you zoom in to Sauvignon Blanc specifically, right? And the first one is the bell pepper pyrazine we discussed briefly. And then the other one is a compound called 4-MMP. And it's an abbreviation for a long chemical name that I'm not going to bother you with. Anyway, that's the compound that many people perceive as a cat pea aroma, and particularly if the 4-MMP levels are quite high, right? So if they reach a certain concentration. And at lower concentrations, 4-MMP is more related to like a gooseberry character or the character of a box tree, if that means something to you. And other descriptions are elderflower and blackcurrant juice specifically.
And so is there any case of because I know that some people like when they're tasting some specific flavor wines that they get very. Like for me, is probably the smell of Sauvignon Blanc is one example. I really can get it quite easily, but with others really difficult. Is there any sort of like scientific reasoning why some people are more susceptible to certain aromas, or do you any stance in that?
Absolutely, yes. So I think in order to understand that, we have to discuss the sense of smell and sense of taste specifically or separately. So the more simple of the two is the sense of taste, because that really is only 5 basic taste sensations. So one of them is sweet, but maybe you know any of the other 4?
Bitterness, acidity?
Yeah, bitter.
No?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So that's 3. Then there's also salty and umami. The last 2 are a bit less important for wine, but just for completeness, I've listed all 5. Umami is also known as savory. So umami is the Japanese term, but savory is another word to describe this taste sensation. So that's all that taste can do. But then there is aroma. So there's this sense of smell, and you're looking at many more different types of sensations. So we're equipped in our nose with around 400 different types of olfactory receptors. So they respond to a very, very large range of sensations. And the interesting thing is that there is some individual difference. So there's some individual variation between people. So some people may have only 399 different receptor types, and other people may have 401. And maybe some receptors don't function as well as for one person. So then if you expose yourself to those single aromatic compounds, you immediately identify that you're not as sensitive to some, but you are more sensitive to other receptors. To other compounds.
So you would put them you would put them in a situation where the certain flavor is the only flavors, and a training sort of the individual or myself to understand exactly what that smells like. And so when I'm thinking about the aromas, so obviously when you're looking at the wine, is usually a blend of different aromas. How do you have your primaries, your secondaries, and sometimes some tertiaries as well? How would you? So for me, it's always like when I analyze the wine, I try to look for each individual one. But how do you go through them, and how does in the nose? How does it work there?
So if you look at the chemical composition of wine, and you're looking at the smell specifically, so the volatile compounds, the compounds that get released into the air, then it's going to be at least 300 different compounds that a chemical instrument would be able to pick up. But not all of them determine the smell, okay? Not all of them contribute to the aroma character of the wine. It's only a handful. It's only maybe around 30 that make up the impression of a smell that a certain wine has. And this is true for the most simple and the most high volume wines out there, as well as for the most premium high-end wines. And to other smells and aromas in nature as well. So in all cases, you're going to find hundreds of different compounds, but only about 30 of them are so-called impact compounds, right? So they determine what the eventual character is of the smell. Yeah, in the case of wine, if you're well trained enough, then you can certainly pick out a few of them. But some compounds are also known to have many different descriptors. So some compounds can elicit only maybe one or two descriptors, and some of them can elicit a handful. So the form and P character we just discussed, that's a good example of something that can take many different forms almost. So it's responsible for the elderflower character as well as for the gooseberry character. But then there are other compounds such as isoamyl acetate. That's an ester. And the main descriptor for that is banana. And you're not really going to get much else out of it, right? So that would be a compound that's relatively simple.
Okay, so you
nature.
have the ester, and I heard about terpenoids. What are these categories? What are they? Like, are they? Which one are the main categories? Which one should I know about? Like, if I wanted to, you have the because I was looking around and I'm trying to understand what are the main flavors, or is that families? I guess the families of aromas.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So a family or like a category of aromatic compounds. And often the compounds inside that category have similar characteristics. So we've discussed pyrazines, that's an important category. Then we also have thiols, and thiols are sulfur-containing compounds, of which form and P is one. And thiols basically sometimes have positive characters, such as those found in Sauvignon Blanc, but they can also have more negative characters. For example, the common fold reduction, or the well-known fold reduction, is also the result of volatile sulfur compounds. And they can smell of rubbish bin, for example, or even like camembert cheese. And with the more negative smells, so to say it. Well, then we have esters. Isoamyl acetate is the famous banana-smelling compound. There's also other esters, for example, ethyl hexanoate smells of apple. There's ethyl acetate, which smells of nail varnish remover. And then there are some compounds like ethyl phenyl acetate, which smells of honey. But most often, these compounds, so the esters, they have fruity smells. Okay, so they're usually responsible for a fruity character. Aldehydes are another class of compounds. Acetaldehyde is probably the most famous one. And these compounds are usually the result of oxidation. Okay, so oxygen reacting with certain other compounds in the wine that create new compounds, aldehydes. Yeah. We have terpenes as well. I think you mentioned that briefly.
Yeah, terpenes. What are they? What do they smell like?
They are typically floral. Okay? So let me name two famous ones. One is called geraniol. It smells of rose. And then we also have linalool, which more smells of an orange peel, or coriander seeds, or blossom. So also a floral character.
Yeah, I mean, this is all usually all flavors that I smelled before, and I never really gave them maybe a specific compound name behind them. Not at least not all of them. So how would you get about, for example, for me, like an example would be maybe the oak flavors, which are quite similar, sometimes similar aromas to the malolactic flavors, the creaminess. How would you train yourself to distinguish these aromas, which are fairly similar, but to this for
I see. I see. Yeah, and that's an interesting one. So the main compound that we have identified, the malolactic conversion, is diacetyl, at least from an aroma perspective, which smells of butter. And some people indeed confuse it with the vanilla character, which is actually the result of oak aging. However, if you try them side by side, then you can tell the difference. But they both have this sort of sweet pastry-like character, so sometimes they get confused, for sure. Within oak compounds, there are some volatile phenolic compounds. And when we think of phenolics, we often think of tannins, so those compounds that are responsible for astringency and structure in wine, as well as color compounds. But some phenolic compounds are so small, they have only a single phenolic group, that they're able to volatilize, so that they're able to release from the liquid and you're able to smell them. And an example of such a compound is vanillin, which smells of vanilla. There's also eugenol, which smells of clove. So these are both phenolic compounds that you can smell. And they are the result of oak aging, particularly if you use newer oak that has at least seen a little bit of charring, so roasting the barrel from the inside. There's also lactones, which are present in oak, but they are sort of more the opposite of the phenols. So if you use a very light charring, then you're going to get more of the lactones. If you use heavy charring, then you're going to get more of the phenols. So then you're going to get more of the vanilla character and the coconut character from Then you're going to get more of the vanilla character and the clove character. Yeah.
Okay. And so if you were, I feel like I'm squeezing all the chemicals out of
Go
you.
ahead.
So if you were, let's talk about something a bit more generic. If you were to consider advise, or if you you talk a lot about the flavors and everything, what would be for you an advice or something you would wish the industry would understand better about the profile? And this is a non-prepared question, and I can put in a little bit on the spot. If you wish, I wish people would understand this a little bit better, or there will be a little bit more.
Yeah, let me try to formulate an answer. Yeah. So something that I wish the industry would understand a bit better.
Yeah, or is it misunderstood? Maybe is a better something that you think is misunderstood in terms of flavors and the aromas, or the general consumer get confused about.
So this is more for people that start out with wine tasting, and this is advice that I wish I'd received sooner in my tasting career, which is I really find it super useful to try wines side by side. And an analogy I like to make here is that of an identical twin. So you may know some identical twins. They really look like each other. If you meet one of them on a Tuesday and the other one on a Wednesday, you can't really tell if they were the same person or if they were different people. But if you place them side by side, then you can suddenly tell their nose is a little bit bigger than the other person, for example. And I think it's a little bit the same with wine. So if you're starting off with wine tasting and say you want to get better at tasting white wines, if you try a Sauvignon Blanc on a Tuesday and a Chardonnay on a Wednesday, it's really quite difficult to say which one has higher acidity, for example. So it's really much more efficient to have them side by side on a single evening, next to each other in the same glass, and then just taste back and forth, go left and right. And then suddenly all those differences will become so much more obvious.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. As something I've done it in the past, and I think is really effective. It's a very good advice to do it, especially with similar wines as well. Maybe from a similar region, you can start seeing some differences, and you start getting some of the differences more than the more so more than if it's alone, and a wine alone.
I can also throw in some other advice, and you can decide if you want to keep both or one of the two. So, one other misunderstanding, I think, is people think that you need a very sensitive palate or a very sensitive nose in order to be a good wine taster. And that's something I don't agree with at all. So I'll tell you a short story about my father, who likes bird watching, right? He likes identifying birds of prey. So he would see a bird flying somewhere and say, that's an eagle, or that's a hawk, or whatever. I'm not like that at all. I even struggle to name 2 birds of prey. So I'm no good at this at all. My dad is obviously older than me, and his eyesight has significantly deteriorated. He's now wearing glasses. So my eyesight is a lot better than his. In other words, my sense of sight is a lot more sensitive than his. Does that make me better at identifying birds of prey? Absolutely not. And it's the same with tasting. So what you really want to be good at is recognizing aromas and identifying aromas. And you don't need a sensitive nose in order to do that. Similarly, like, since you don't have to have a sensitive
I can see that. I can see it comes down a lot of the time. There is this stigma. I mean, as myself as well, I've done judging a lot of things that people think we have an incredible sense of aromas, but I think it comes down mostly on training and the analyzing the wine one at a time, and with years of experimenting and getting a lot of the time the wine wrong. I mean, that's the case. Most of the times, if you give me a blind tasting, it will be. I would like to get the odds for it to see how many times I actually get it. But it's very interesting. So last a couple of questions. Where so does any bad associated? Let's talk about some of the bad aromas. What musty, or I'll let you choose one, then you can tell me a little bit about more. It could be the cork flavors or the musty aromas or some of the associations. Which one would you like to explore a bit more? Which one is your favorite to discuss of the bad aromas in wine?
Great, yeah. So let's pick the most famous one, which is TCA, and it's short for trichloroanisole. Okay, so this has been identified as the compound responsible for cork taint or musty taint, because what the smell is like is musty. So it kind of smells like a damp cellar or a damp basement, something moldy, something wet and damp. And it's primarily been identified in natural corks and agglomerated corks, so different types of cork products. And as a result, different alternatives have been developed, such as most famously probably the screw cap, which dramatically reduces the incidence of cork taint. Some people don't like to refer to this as cork taint, but rather as musty taint, because there's other origins of this flavor apart from the cork. So it can be picked up in a winery environment as well, or even during transport of wine bottles. So it's not always the cork, but really in most cases, it is going to be cork. And it's estimated that about 3% of wine bottles fitted with the cork can develop this fault.
Okay, you say 8%.
Can develop this undesirable character.
Oh, it is 3%. Sorry, I missed that. Okay.
At least 3%, yeah. Historically, though, the percentage would have been much higher, but there have been some improvements being made and introduced in the cork production process that has reduced the incidence of cork taint. So cork taint can always be traced back to some component of chlorine. So it's in the name trichloroanisole. Some people even get like a swimming pool or other chlorine associations when they smell the fault. And this chlorine is typically picked up in the cork growing environment and then reacts with other components, and eventually molds that can grow in the cork will transform it into trichloroanisole, which produces the off flavor, so the undesirable flavor. Molds do this basically as a survival mechanism, because the precursor to TCA is called TCP, it's trichlorophenol, and it's an antiseptic, so it's toxic to molds. And what molds try to do is get rid of that compound in order to survive, and then they turn it into TCA, which is not toxic to them.
I see. That's new to me. That's amazing. So for me, talking about TCA, sometimes it can be ever so slightly cork or very corked, and sometimes I get it. Usually it comes in a form of like suppressing a bit the wine. If it's similar for your experience, if it's lightly corked, I get sometimes the wine is a little bit less presence of other aromas. Would you agree with that? You get less if it's.
I hear this around me a lot. So, based on, say, anecdotal evidence, I would agree. I've done a little bit of experimentation with this, so adding TCA in very low levels to wines, and then most people can't really tell the difference with a wine that's unaffected, so where no TCA is added. So I can't really confirm it with my tastings, I have to say. Sometimes when the wine just lacks a little bit in character, maybe the cork is blamed. It could be that could be an explanation of why you see it so often. Or maybe there could be other compounds involved as well in the cork taint that maybe would suppress fruity characters. But I can't give you a full
Okay, that's okay. I understand. Yeah. I mean, we already got into the half an hour. It's fantastic. I can see the passion about you and your knowledge about all the different chemicals and everything. Would you just before I let you go and everything, would you just tell me where we can get the information about your website and your courses and some other information about you? If you use any social media, people can find you.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm on Instagram. If you search for Art of Tasting, that's you will find me then. There's my website, which is artoftasting.nl. NL is short for Netherlands. So I'm based in the Netherlands. And if you visit my website, on the main page, you will see an event schedule. So you should be able to see my upcoming courses. My website is also where you can find my web shop. So I sell tasting kits, both for white wines and for red wines over there, in 2 different sizes. So you can either choose for a 50 milliliter sample, which is about an ISO standard glass of wine, or 187 milliliters, which is a little over 3 of those glasses. So there would be more of a 3-person tasting kit.
Yeah, you sent me some of your sample kits, and I was really impressed by the quality of the chemicals. It was like a professionally grade things. It's not the things I could have picked up in maybe some of the shops. It's definitely something I could never get my hands on them, which I think is really interesting. It shows that then you definitely have some industry background, and probably from some of the place you worked and picked up some of these the flavor there. But yes, it's really interesting, and I think if someone is interested in learning about flavors of wine and tasting about wine, it could be a great way to get started, or maybe clarifying some of the flavors if you really are struggling with some of the flavors, if you're having to do some exams or things like that, which is really interesting. But I mean, Sietze, thank you so much for your time, and And I hope to see you in London. Maybe I will come to one of your tasting in person.
Great. Yeah, I hope to see you there.
You listen to the Looking into Wine podcast with Sietze Wijma, MSc Sensory Science graduate and founder of The Art of Tasting. You can find some more information on the link on the show notes below. If you enjoyed this podcast, remember to like and subscribe. And to share it with your friends. You can find Looking into Wine on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the major listening apps. We are back after a little break, finding our footing again to find the new guest. We have a wealthy array of guests coming on the show. We're starting a career show, career talks. Where we talk with editors, students and teachers about the various career in the wine industry to see how one can progress into the wine industry. And the next episode will be with the editor of Decanter, talking to us how they started in the wine industry and how one should look at writing and what are the major factors for one to become a journalist. I hope you enjoy the show and see you soon.